let them in as they arrive. But we want to go ahead and get you started this afternoon. I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us for this program on federal preservation advocacy. Looks like we've got some great representation across New York State, so we're really pleased with that. If you don't know me, I'm Christina Hingle, the Preservation Policy Manager at the Preservation League of New York State. We've got a couple of staff members on with us as well, including Jay DiLorenzo, our president, and Erin Tobin, the Vice President of Policy and Preservation here at the League. So we're really excited today to be joined by some experts working on federal preservation advocacy. You've probably seen them around. As you can see on your screen, we have Mike Phillips, Public Policy Director at the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. We have Sprague, Vice President of Government Relations for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and then also Patrick Robertson, the Executive Director of the Historic Tax Credit Coalition. So what they're going to do today is they're going to provide us some context surrounding a couple things, including the 2020 election, what the current political climate may mean for preservation initiatives, including the federal historic tax credit. And they're also going to be giving us some tips on how we can work to refine our advocacy and our messaging regarding our historic preservation asks. So we're really excited to have them here and want to thank them for their time. Just a quick housekeeping note that following the presentation, we're hoping to have some time for questions and open discussion. I'll also defer to the guest speakers on if they want to take any questions at the end of their particular section of the presentation. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our guest speakers to get us started. And I think we're going to start off with Patrick.
Sure, thank you. I have the unenviable task of just sort of talking about politics writ large in America, which is a super simple topic that has no acrimony and no bad feelings right now. For those of you who have been on the moon, we had an election in November. I think luckily for New York, you didn't see as many of the ads as your friends in maybe Arizona or Florida did because you weren't a battleground state, but it seems unlikely that anyone didn't hear what was going on with the presidential race. Obviously, we have a new president, but between the election and the new president, we had an insurrection, a special election, an inauguration, and a few other things happened. So we're going to try in the next 11 or so minutes to smush all those things together, let you know sort of what they mean and what they mean for the federal historic tax credit. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Patrick Robertson. I have my own lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. called Confluence Government Relations. One of my clients is the Federal Historic Tax Credit Coalition. I know we've got a couple of members and a former member on. So a lot of you have heard me say this before. To our members who are going to be on the call tonight, I apologize, you're going to have to hear some of this twice. But look forward to giving you a little bit of a sense of what's going on and what comes next for federal HTC advocacy, and mostly want to start by thanking you all for having me. This is something that we do a fair amount of, but it's always great to be able to share with other folks what's going on in Washington and ask for your help advocating for things that are beneficial to all of us in the HTC space. So I'm going to start with what happened in Congress, and that is that the conventional wisdom sort of came true in that Democrats retained the House and Democrats made a really hard run and ended up retaking the Senate, but that's not the whole story. Democrats lost, I think on the next slide, you'll see that they lost 15 or 18 seats in the House, leaving their, oh, sorry, we're starting with the Senate. I was just kidding. So Republicans ended up losing their Senate majority, but only in the United States Senate can you lose your majority by tying, right? It is an arcane institution full of weird wrinkles. And one of the wrinkles is there are 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. In any other sort of representative democracy, you'd end up with some sort of governing faction situation. But because we only have two political parties, we have a different system, and the vice president breaks the tie. So the Senate is 50-50, the vice president breaks the tie. The Senate's been working over the last week or so to come up with a power sharing arrangement They're basing this off of what happened in 2001, which is the last time there was a tied Senate. And in that instance, committees had equal representation, but bills could be reported out of committee on a tie vote as opposed to needing a majority. And a lot of that will stay the same. Republican leader Mitch McConnell was looking for an assurance from Democratic leader Chuck Schumer that he wouldn't change the filibuster. Chuck Schumer wasn't going to be able to give that assurance. Mitch McConnell knew that. They played this out for a week. They both look like they fought, and now we have an agreement about how to share power going forward in the Senate. Mitch McConnell hangs his hat on the idea that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema from West Virginia and Arizona, respectively, have said they won't get rid of the legislative filibuster. Chuck Schumer hangs his hat on the fact that he can still try to get rid of the legislative filibuster if Republicans are being too obstructionist and we move forward with the business of the Senate, right? Very inside Washington, not super interesting, but at the same time relevant to what we're talking about. The Senate after Election Day was at 50 Republicans and 48 Democrats, which includes 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats. And then there were these 2 special elections in Georgia, which, much to my surprise, Democrats swept. For those of you who listen to me regularly, I said that was an unlikely outcome. People have since thrown that back at me and said, you said it was unlikely. I said it did, but I didn't say it couldn't happen, and it happened. We've got some new members from Tennessee, Colorado, from New Mexico and Arizona, a couple of retirements in Wyoming, Kansas, and an open seat a loss in Alabama for Democrats. But the Senate looks pretty similar to the way it looked before. The Republicans who came in are a little further to the right. The Democrats who came in are a little further to the left. The middle is having a little trouble holding in the Senate, although it's going to get its moment in the sun here over the next 2 years. And Mark Kelly of that list of freshman members is probably the most in the middle member in the Senate that came in this year. On the right-hand side there, you see a little note about your folks in New York. Because elections never really end, they just start all over again. Newly minted Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is up for re-election in 2022 in a signal of where his challenges will come from. His first interview as Majority Leader was 45 minutes with Rachel Maddow, trying to mollify the left side of his party. The best parlor game in Washington currently, which of course plays out over Zoom, is whether Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will run against Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. And so he's doing everything he can to protect his left flank. I also assume that those of you in northern New York and in areas outside the city will see a lot more of Chuck Schumer in the coming months, in no small part to make sure that every Democrat knows that in the city, he's as left as he can be, but outside the city, he's still Chuck Schumer. I mean, he's got a tough balancing act that he's going to try to execute. And I mean, Chuck Schumer at 30-something beat Alphonse D'Amato, right? And he is trying to learn the lesson and defend himself in the exact reverse position if Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez decides to run against him. So it's a fascinating political science study and one that you all will have a front row seat for going forward. So that's what the Senate looks like, Democratic control, but quite narrow. As we move on to the House, I think that, again, conventional wisdom was certain, 50-50 tiebreaker, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell. We covered all that, so I apologize. I was a little ahead of myself. And I think the next slide's about budget reconciliation. And so we're going to have a brief primer on budget reconciliation really quickly. This gentleman in the middle of the screen is Robert C. Byrd from my home state of West Virginia. He was in the United States Senate for 51 years, which is an incredible run. He was Appropriations Committee Chairman. He was Majority Leader. He was Minority Leader. He was President Pro Tem, and about 43 other things. But none of those matter in the context of what we're talking about. What does matter is something called the Byrd rule. So when parties are in the majority but don't have 60 votes, either they're in the majority of both houses, they have a tool called budget reconciliation. And essentially what they do is they pass a budget, a joint budget between the House and the Senate, and they set either spending targets or savings targets. And under those targets, each committee gets the bill. They get to meet their particular target and then come back and they mush it all together and it gets passed again through the House and the Senate. And you think to yourself, why would you go through all these problems if you could just pass a bill? And the answer is the filibuster. The Senate has a 60 vote filibuster threshold that's really been amplified over the last 30 years. So now every piece of legislation in the Senate basically needs 60 votes. In doing so, it's strengthened the position of budget reconciliation, which requires a simple majority vote in the United States Senate. Now, there are more hoops to go through. There's more process you have to run through. So you pass the budget in the House, you pass the budget in the Senate, it has the targets, you conference it, you come back, you give the targets to the individual committees, they come back, you mush it all together, and then you put a bill on the floor that is subject to a 50 vote threshold in the Senate. And Robert C. Byrd saw the potential abuse in this, and he created something called the Byrd Rule. And the Byrd Rule states that nothing that is done in budget reconciliation can happen that doesn't have a budgetary impact. So it either has to spend or save money. And I think the simplest way to think about this is in 2017, House and Senate Republicans passed their tax reform law through budget reconciliation. And in doing so, they called it the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was Section 1 of the bill. When the Senate parliamentarian got a hold of the bill and was looking through things to see whether they had budgetary impact or not, calling the bill the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act does not raise money and it does not spend money. And so the parliamentarian ruled that it was out of order. In order to appeal the rule of the parliamentarian, you have to have a 60 vote threshold in the Senate. And so the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is generally referred to as HR1, or a bill to amend the tax code of 1986, and not the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in official statutory language. To those of you who enjoy puns or terrible Washington humor, things that are subjected to the budget reconciliation process and then the Byrd Rule and are removed from a bill are called Byrd droppings, which, you know, is awful and yet appropriate in thinking about them. So budget reconciliation is a way for part of the Biden agenda to get done. And if you want to think about things in the Biden agenda that could be done and couldn't be done under budget reconciliation, if you want to give $1,400 checks to all Americans, clear budgetary impact, easily done in budget reconciliation. If you'd like to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, no budgetary impact, no budget reconciliation, you need 60 votes. So that's sort of how budget reconciliation works. So Mike is frozen on my screen. If he can still hear me, we'll go to the House slide. If not, we can just talk about the House until we get him back. But generally, yes, the House has the same budget reconciliation process, but they don't have a 60 vote threshold. They are a majority rule institution. And so they don't have the Byrd Rule. They don't have any of those problems. They just wait for what the Senate sends back. Again, the current breakdown of the House is about 222 Democrats, 211 Republicans, with a couple of empty seats as Democrats start going to the administration and a few other things happen going forward. So Democrats who had a 23 seat advantage last Congress have a 5 or 6 seat advantage this Congress, which means they're going to be more bipartisan. You can see sort of the list of everything that went on in the House for your reference. I want to focus on a couple of things. Again, not to leave out New York, you still have an unsettled congressional race that no one can quite decide what to do with. It's within less votes than I have on my fingers and toes. And being from West Virginia, I need those to count very high. So they're still trying to figure out exactly how to seat someone from New York and what to do. But there have been some, relatively significant changes. I will note that before Donald Trump came into office, there were 241 federal Republicans, and something like 150 of them have left office since January of 2017, which is a pretty big turnover within the Republican Party. And it's why you hear people talk about the Republican Party really being the party of Donald Trump in some ways. So that's kind of what's going on in the House. If we can flip to the next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on. But again, here's the 211, 222. One incumbent Republican lost, 12 incumbent Democrats, a couple of vacancies. The Speaker has a narrower margin to work with, and we move forward from there. I will note that almost all of the Democratic losses came in districts that Donald Trump won in 2016, and in most cases still won in 2020. So that's where that crossover is coming from. You'll recall the conversations that people have had for a while about how there are blue districts and there are red districts and there are fewer and fewer middle districts. And you're seeing that. We're about to go through another round of redistricting between now and the 2022 election, where states like West Virginia and I actually think New York are going to lose congressional seats, and places like Arizona or New Mexico or Texas are going to gain them to stay at 435. Just a couple of quick things about the Electoral College. The margin of victory was very close to the same in 2016 and 2020. I've always said, if you step back and look at these things, in 1992, America voted for someone who they wanted to hang out with in Bill Clinton, and they got a decent economy and a tech bubble, and they kept him. And then they voted against the 8 years of the Clinton presidency for George W. Bush, who earned a second term on a war footing. But people were starting to feel like America was leaving them behind, and they voted for change in voting for Barack Obama. And the people who voted for change didn't get the change they wanted to, and their reaction to that was to vote for a guy who would change the whole system, who was Donald Trump. And then maybe he went a little too far, and we went back to the steady hand in Joe Biden. So that's sort of the big picture of the last 30 years. The question is, where does the electorate go from here? And what are some of their options? And, that's a whole nother can of worms that we can talk about. We'll wait at least 6 months to talk about the 2024 presidential election. But there are a lot of questions out there about what happens next to both parties. So this, on the third bullet, I'll just note, it says that Joe Biden, who turns 78 on November 20th, is the oldest first-term president in U.S. history. It turns out he's actually the oldest president in U.S. history. President Reagan was 77 on his last day in office. And Joe Biden's obviously 78 on his first day. We looked back at a couple of things, and I found it fascinating for presidential historians that John F. Kennedy was younger than like 6 of his successors. And I think if you look back, we're going to be in the same spot with President Obama. He was certainly younger than President Trump. He's certainly younger than Joe Biden. And so you're going to see this trend where successive presidents were born after or before Barack Obama for a while, which is interesting. Then I just want to focus on the last bullet for a minute. So I told you we went from election to insurrection to special election to inauguration. I am teaching a lot of 1st and 5th grade spelling words this week in my house, but we're going to get away from the TION endings and also think about impeachment and budget reconciliation and a few other things. We talked about budget reconciliation on Monday night. The House impeachment managers delivered their impeachment resolution to the Senate. This morning, the senators were sworn in as jurors. In the past, in presidential impeachment cases, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has presided. In this case, Patrick Leahy, who's a Vermonter, and the most senior Democrat in the Senate will preside. And they're going to give the president 2 weeks to respond to the impeachment resolution, and then there will be a trial. There were about 45 minutes a couple of weeks ago when people thought it was possible that the Senate would vote to convict the former president. That seems very unlikely at this point. It seems almost certain that he won't be convicted. He will get Republican votes to convict for the first time, and maybe a significant number, just not 17, which is what they're going to need. And then there's a question about whether there's a censure or some other kind of compromise that comes out of it. But the Senate's going to spend a couple of weeks confirming Biden administration nominees. The Treasury Secretary was confirmed yesterday. The Secretary of State was confirmed today. The Commerce Secretary's hearing is today. The OMB Director's hearing should be soon. They are plugging through those things, and then everything will sort of stop for impeachment. And they'll work on impeachment for about a week and have a vote on impeachment. And then they'll really get to this $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that President Biden has floated. And the conventional wisdom in Washington at this point is Joe Biden can either have a bipartisan COVID relief package or he can have his $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, but he can't have both. A bipartisan package would need to be smaller. $1.9 trillion would need to be passed through budget reconciliation. So I think the next slide is a little bit about the impact of COVID on community development, which is what we're really all here to talk about. But you can't talk about all those things without talking about the bigger picture, because Washington is so enamored with itself that it would never allow you to talk about what's important to you without talking about what's important to Washington first. So when the pandemic hit in the HTC world, we saw a number of different effects that we've been talking about. Certainly, projects that were in process were shut down from a worker perspective. A ton of projects had trouble getting materials, be it drywall or couches, or in the case of my kitchen, a microwave for 8 months. So we understand if you're trying to outfit some sort of large commercial development, any of these supply chain issues are going to hurt you. And then in addition to those very tangible things, there were also the intangibles, like the freezing of the credit markets and different local regulations about when people could be on site, and if someone tested positive, how long the job site had to be shut down, and who could be there and who couldn't. And so all of those things have come together to sort of put a real damper on the HTC market nationally. And Shaw's going to talk a little bit about how we hope to fix that. There was a COVID package that passed at the end of last year with a number of things in it that didn't include HTC because of some of the rules that they set forth. That included that it was extenders only and temporary provisions only, or this LIHTC thing that got in because it was viewed as directly related to the pandemic and the dearth of affordable housing as people are out there trying to save their jobs and their livelihoods. So, but the House passed a bill that Shaw will talk about in a few minutes that had a number of these provisions. When we went to Congress in April during the pandemic, we asked for sort of three major things: a 30% bump up in the HTC, or a bump up to 30% for the HTC for the next 5 years to help those credit market freezes, those materials, those workers, the other financing, any other problems that people are having get through and sort of supercharge the HTC market. The provisions of our Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act. And then we also asked Congress to extend the 24-month rehab period, or the 60-month rehab period for phased projects, for an extra year because of the delays. We also asked the IRS to make that extension, and the IRS did. So we're really happy that folks have an extra 12 months to get their 24-month substantial rehab test done amidst all this disruption. So I think, Shaw, this is where I turn it over to you to talk through things. But if I'm wrong about that, let me know, and I'll just keep talking. It's really what I'm best at.
Well, thanks, Patrick. I can pick up from here, and thanks for the overview and teeing it up. And thanks to the Preservation League and to Christina and Jay and Aaron for hosting the webinar today and for the invitation to present on our historic tax credit advocacy priorities, both long-standing efforts to improve the credit, but also our more recent efforts in response to the economic impact of the pandemic. So like Patrick was saying, we did work with a number of several national partners last year to develop recommendations on how to put historic rehab to work for our nation's economic recovery. That was the previous slide. And I'll just note one piece of that: increasing the amount of the credit in times of economic hardship is not new. It's not a new idea. We actually built off of efforts that Congress took in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina to increase the credit. And they did that it happened with great effect. So even after the credit, the bump up expired, historic rehab activity continued at a higher level than the pre bump up levels. So we're hopeful that that argument will carry the day with additional efforts and make it into a package that we'll talk about in a moment. But it'll be a big lift. That is a big ask to impose that nationwide. Previously, it's targeted to those areas of disaster declared areas. So this would be nationwide. So that is where we will need your help. And this becomes clear when you look at this slide here. So when the mandatory shutdowns began in March, Congress first acted to pass an $8 billion Coronavirus Preparedness Act, then another $100 billion through the Families First Coronavirus Recovery Act. And by late March, Congress had passed the massive $2.2 trillion CARES Act that we've come to know. So these initial efforts didn't really present opportunities to include improvements to the historic tax credit. They were more like economic triage, and less about the long-term economic recovery. And that's really where our sweet spot, where the legislation focuses on our longer-term economic recovery. So then, it actually took, sorry, back one, Mike, still. So then it actually took Congress 9 months to get to the latest injection of economic relief in the omnibus appropriations bill that passed in December. But again, here, a bit thin on strengthening community development tax credits. And as Patrick mentioned, President Biden has just put another $1.9 trillion on the table for Congress to consider. So next slide, please. So where we have found our most significant opportunity, like Patrick alluded to, was not in the COVID relief package, but in the $1.5 trillion House-passed infrastructure package known as the Moving Forward Act. So passage of this bill in the House on July 2nd, back one, Mike, does mark the first time that significant improvements to the HTC incentive were approved by either chamber in decades. So this is really a major milestone for the historic rehab sector and is a testament to the work that's put in to educate members about the importance of this credit and the value that it brings to our communities. Next slide, Mike. So taking a closer look at what's in the bill for the historic tax credits, there are both temporary and permanent changes proposed for the HTC. In the fall, a lot of the feedback that we were getting was we needed to focus on temporary provisions, that these relief bills were not the place to try for permanent changes in the tax code. So we spent a lot of time talking about the temporary increase in the credit from 20 to 30%. And this, if you can squint and see on this slide, would raise that 20 to 30% for all credits until 2024. And then it would ramp back down over the subsequent years, and by 2027 back down to the 20% level. The other provision in HR2, which Patrick mentioned already, is the measuring period. So that did make it into the bill, but fortunately, Secretary Treasury did extend the measuring period until March 31st, 2021, giving more time for projects that were underway to meet those HTC deadlines. The permanent provisions, which if you're familiar with HTC Go, that's where they were pulled from. So the increase to the credit for small projects that are under 2.5 million in QREs, lowering the substantial rehab test from 100% to 50% of adjusted basis, which would make the credit work for more buildings, not just those that are in great need of rehab. The other provision would eliminate the requirement that the value of the HTC needs to be deducted from a building's basis. This is one that we expect would restore the most value to the credit, the pre-2017 tax reform value. And it would also make it a lot easier to combine the credits with LIHTC projects, which is an important story that we need to tell from the historic preservation standpoint as to how this credit is helping to produce affordable housing. And finally, there's a section that will make public elementary and secondary schools eligible for historic tax credits, not directly, but through a public-private partnership during the rehab. But the school would remain a school during the process and then revert to the school entirely after the project is completed. That was new, but not something that was on the top of our list, but we were happy to see it there. Next slide, please. So Patrick noted also that next steps. Where do we go from here? There's a new COVID relief bill that's been put forward. Not a lot of enthusiasm to quickly approve a $1.9 trillion bill so soon after passing the $900 billion bill in December. But there is pressure both from the left to move forward with reconciliation, leave the Republicans behind if they can't get on board with that number, pressure on the right to bring that number down and make it bipartisan. And then you've got this new and emergent group, the Sweet 16, as they're being called, of moderates on both sides of the aisle that are already emphasizing the need for additional COVID-related relief. So we'll see where that goes, but it will really shape, I think, a lot of the tone and tenor that we'll see over the next 6 months, year for this Congress, really. So whichever way that moves forward, we're going to have our work cut out for us. We are working with our legislative supporters on the Hill on the new HTC improvement legislation, which we expect to be introduced in the next month. We also anticipate the bill is going to build on the momentum that we've created around the previous HTC Go bill and HR2. So that strategically, that's where it makes sense. This is what members are familiar with. It's moved through one chamber. This is our quickest path to success by our estimation. Advocacy efforts will be just critical to gain enough support to be included in one of these larger vehicles that Mike will speak to in a moment. So which legislative vehicles are we looking at? And these include the next round of COVID relief, particularly if it focuses more on economic recovery than direct pandemic response. That remains to be seen. An infrastructure bill. This is where we've seen our most traction to date. We also put in the debt limit as a marker because it falls just before, it expires just before the August recess. And so that could serve as a backstop where we could see that spur action by Congress on a broader legislative package. So that's a date to have in the back of your head, as well as the fiscal year 22 appropriations process and an end of the year tax bill, which almost always seem to coincide in December. But that's a quick snapshot of some of the inflection points where we will be looking for the opportunities, and we'll ask you all to be ready to jump into action. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Sean. My name is Mike Phillips. I'm with National Trust Community Investment Corporation, We're a tax credit syndicator, and our parent organization is the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I work on public policy with the National Trust Government Relations team, but also with the Historic Tax Credit Coalition. And Patrick, since my boss, Merrill Hoopengardner, who's the president of NTCIC, is also the chair of the coalition. So I'll kind of piggyback on what Patrick and Shaw discussed, but first let's talk about the channels on how to do what Shaw recommended as far as gaining advocacy once this legislation is introduced. How do we get it wrapped into a larger legislative vehicle? The channels for influence, one of the main channels will be the tax writing committees. So here's a snapshot of what the Senate Finance Committee roster is anticipated to look like in 2021. So these are senators that will be seeing tax-related proposals. Our proposal will likely come through the Senate Finance Committee as well. Always helpful to have other members chime in that they're supportive of that they're hearing from others on that. Obviously, Majority Leader Schumer will be overseeing all of these committees and the process and everything, and weighing in with him is critical as the committees work through their proposals and what is going to be offered in the 117th Congress. House Ways and Means, New York has quite a few players on here, the Democrats and the Republicans. So those districts will be key. I think what we really need as far as advocacy is we need members talking about our issue. As we explain why our proposal is important, why these new provisions are needed, we need members of Congress going down to the committee and saying, hey, what are we doing about the HTC? This is something I care about. This is something I'm hearing from members back home. I have project examples. I have people struggling with the pandemic. I see permanent. These are very influential members from New York that can really push things forward on the House side. Also, we have supporters since we've been at this a while, dating way before tax reform. Shaw and I and Patrick were working on the HTC and protecting the HTC 5-6 years before tax reform even happened. So there's a lot of support built up. And then as we have brought forth new ideas from the industry and from preservation advocates, there's been a rallying cry, and there's been supporters that have become our champions on preservation issues. So if you look at the previous bill that we had in the 116th Congress, you can see quite a bit of support coming out of New York from both the Democrats and the Republicans. So these are other members that will be very important to connect with and share the bill once it's introduced and explain what's going on the ground with projects and encourage them to speak to the committee and leadership to include historic tax credit provisions in these moving legislative vehicles. So these are the Senate co-sponsors of the bill. Obviously, there's less senators than House members, but these individual senators have a lot of clout and are able to get things done, and we have a very bipartisan coalition there. And like I said before, Senator Schumer will be key in sharing this proposal with him. And as someone like Ben Cardin comes to him and says, hey, this is something I really care about. This is a bill that I've introduced. And then Schumer has heard from back home, and then you have this kind of nexus point of what a senator is speaking to him about is resonating with him because he's heard the same thing from his constituents back home. So what do we need to do? The bill will be introduced in February. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for this bill to be introduced, we encourage advocates to share projects that have been impacted by the pandemic. So if you're experiencing financial challenges, delays, extra costs, issues with local governments, the inability to get local funding into your project, we want to hear from you, and we want to help you share that story with members of Congress. We want you to share the HR2 provisions. Those will be the building blocks for the new legislation in February. And once the bill is introduced, we want you to reconnect with those members of Congress, and we want all preservation advocates and all people who use the historic tax credit to contact their members of Congress and ask their member to co-sponsor the new version of the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act. And then we also want to share how these permanent enhancement provisions will help unlock new projects and will contribute to the economic recovery, because we believe that it'll just open up a whole new realm of projects, make projects easier to do. And also in the pandemic landscape, something like the 50% rehab test instead of 100% rehab test will help buildings like in uses like hospitality be retrofitted to something like housing. So there are a lot of different angles that can be shared with members of Congress of how these provisions will benefit preservation and historic tax credit projects and basically jumpstart revitalization in communities again. So I want to encourage you to look for updates and resources. When the bill's introduced, like I said, the key point is we need to get the co-sponsorship on there, because folks will directly look at how much a bill has support. And those members will be basically joining the team. And when our champions are moving the bill forward, they will connect with those members that have co-sponsored and say, hey, we're almost to the finish line here. We need you to weigh in with leadership, or reach across the aisle and say, hey, you need to contact your leadership or make this an important aspect in the committee. So be looking for this introduction in February, because that will really launch a lot of this advocacy. But in the meantime, please connect with members of Congress and share what you have going on the ground and challenges. And we are happy to do that and happy to help you do that.
So if I could just jump in for 1 second, Mike, when you're talking about that, we've talked a lot about Chuck Schumer. I just want to note for a second what a huge champion Brian Higgins has been of the HTC. He introduced the bill that would have moved the HTC to 30% that eventually got included in HR2 last year. And so to those of you who are talking to Mr. Higgins or Lindsay or Matt or anybody in his office around Buffalo, keep doing what you're doing because it's working. So thank you for that. And not to say that Tom Reed or Tom Swazi or any of the other members haven't been helpful, but Brian Higgins has really stuck his neck out. And I just wanted to take a minute to recognize that.
Yeah, I have witnessed firsthand Congressman Higgins' commitment to the HTC. I've walked into his office to meet with his staff. He hears someone's talking about the HTC. He wants to call me into his office and discuss it. So, he's got a real passion for it. He's a son of a bricklayer. He used to see demolished buildings and bricks laying around everywhere, and he would gather those bricks and bring them to recycle them basically to a new site. And he says, we don't have to do that anymore. We can rehab the buildings, and the buildings don't have to be demolished, and look what we can do in revitalizing buildings using the historic tax credit. So just a few resources. We do have a legislation document to share with how all these provisions connect to the bigger picture. And we have maps and lists of projects for New York. So these are resources that can help you in communicating with your members of Congress. These will be updated once the legislation will be introduced, but we'll be sure to share these with the league. And also, we put together a template to help you write your members of Congress as well. So this is something that we're developing, and when the bill is introduced, we will have available and can share with the league as well, that it's a draft letter that you can copy and paste and then fill in the key areas about your community, your projects, challenges on the ground, and why you are supportive of these enhanced provisions of the historic tax credit. So stay tuned. Please reach out to us if you would like any assistance in contacting your legislators now, but also please be ready for when the bill is introduced next month. Let's hit the ground running, and let's first of all get the vocal champions of the historic tax credit on the bill and supportive, and let's work as a team to gather, if all the members of New York, if possible, to be supportive of enhancing the historic tax credit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike and Sean, Patrick. That was a great overview for everyone. We hope it was helpful. We've got a few minutes here if we want to open it up to group discussion for comments or questions. We have till about 2 o'clock. I've got to jump at 2, unfortunately, but Erin might be able to stay on for a couple more if it warrants it. So does someone want to get us started with any questions or follow-up? Patrick?
Hi, everyone. I have a question on the measuring period on the actual Treasury guidance. Is there any further action on that beyond the March 31st extension? Because one thing that I think actually could be helpful is just allowing the 60-month basis test on all projects for some extended period of time. Because working on a project where there's actually a trough in spending that happened during the shutdown, and I can imagine that there's other projects that weren't planned as phased projects, that it actually might be helpful just to have the Treasury say, through a certain period of time, use the 60-month window, even if it wasn't phased. Because the accountants have been hesitant to say that the project was phased, without the documentation beforehand, even though the NPS has been retroactively approving projects as phased now. So I just didn't know if there was any, this is something that doesn't require legislation or anything. It's just, I assume the Treasury can do it on its own.
Yeah, it's not something we've asked them to do at this point. We asked for the extra 12 months and they granted it on all kinds of projects. And this is frankly the first anyone's raised that issue to me, Patrick. So I'm happy to sort of add it to my list of things that we're keeping an eye on and see if we can't make some progress on it if we hear about it elsewhere.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be tremendously helpful to a lot of projects, I'm guessing.
Anyone else want to jump in with questions? Just feel free to unmute yourself.
Christina, well, people are thinking I can address Mike Puma's question in the chat. I've not heard any talk about severing tax credit projects from the register listings. I don't think that it's something that's come up. I will say that within the HTC, while we work really closely with the Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Officers, there's also some natural tension. And we're having regular sort of quarterly conversations with NPS and the SHPOs about how the program can work better. There's another proposal out there for something called the Rehab Act. And this is something that would sort of reinstate the 10% credit and make it 16% and then give it a bump up if you do certain things that would allow you to rehab old buildings and do some infill near transit hubs without some of the Secretary of Standards guardrails. And so there are certainly people out there who have frustrations, who are pushing other ideas to try to get to what you have suggested. And we're trying to figure out what the best way to get there is.
And I'll just add on to that comment, just on this notion of bringing back the 10% credit and what it could mean. I think as soon as it was dropped during the 2017 tax reform, conversations began about bringing it back. The Rehab Act, like Patrick mentioned, seems to be the most robust and focused effort to date on reinstating that, but it does represent a potential avenue going forward, and we'll see how much traction it picks up when it's introduced in this Congress. It was bipartisan, but again, we're not too far out from those major changes in tax reform. So I think it'll just depend on what the appetite is on the Senate side to undo what it did so recent in the recent past.
Al, this is Jessie from Buffalo. I would just add to that, Shaw, that I think given the National Trust and the League and other folks' efforts to have preservation be perceived as more inclusive, there's a real equity issue involved, as you all know, in terms of the tax credit, and it's being tied so closely to National Register standards. And so there's a real opportunity for the trust and for others to kind of walk the walk with equity by really advancing that type of legislation, which is tied a little bit less to those standards and more to just the buildings that are important to people, but that we might have trouble listing for other issues that everyone here knows that we don't need to take up time to talk about.
Yep, no, it's a great point, Jesse, and it does offer sort of an elegant solution to working around National Register, which I think also needs to be addressed. I think we probably need both approaches there, but I think you're absolutely right. It does offer an important way forward that could be a great solution. So the trust supports supported the Rehab Act, as did the Historic Tax Credit Coalition. So if you haven't taken a look at it, I encourage you all to look more closely at the text from the previous Congress.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? Great. Well,
I'd just like to make one comment that, well, I was just going to say that just want to thank the League for all of their advocacy over the years. And they really are players that are helping the Historic Tax Credit in Washington, D.C. with Preservation Advocacy Week, with the Historic Tax Credits Coalition's Lobby Day, usually in June. They've participated in those, they've gathered their members, and the League has really moved the ball forward in Washington, and all of us in Washington are really thankful.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. I just want to thank you and Sean, Patrick. Obviously, we're always happy to help. We're really looking forward to the virtual advocacy day this year in March. It's certainly not going to be the same, but we'll take what we can get. So we'll be closely following the federal legislation on this, and we'll be sharing with everyone on this call today how they can help, and how we certainly need their support to support these preservation initiatives that are moving at the federal level. So with that, I will close us out, and again, just thank you so much to our speakers and for everyone for taking an hour of time to spend with us on federal advocacy initiatives this year. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.